In 1882, workers built a bridge 301 feet above the ground in 94 days. Not with steel, not with concrete, with wood. The Kinzua viaduct stretched 2,053 feet across a Pennsylvania valley, and every inch of it was timber. Douglas fir, white pine, hemlock. Trees cut from the surrounding forest, shaped by hand, and assembled into bents that rose higher than a 30-story building. The men who built it worked without harnesses, without nets, without hard hats. At 300 feet, the wind didn't just blow, it grabbed you. If you lost your footing, you had 3 seconds to understand what was happening before you hit the rocks below. This wasn't an isolated project. Between 1870 and 1900, America built hundreds of wooden railroad trestles across canyons, gorges, and rivers. Structures that defied every instinct about what wood should be asked to do. And the men who built them, most of them are forgotten. No plaques, no monuments, just names and dusty ledgers if they were recorded at all. But before we talk about how they died, we need to understand why anyone would attempt something this insane in the first place. The problem facing American railroads in the late 1800s wasn't a lack of ambition, it was geography. You're trying to connect the East Coast to the West. You're trying to move timber, coal, ore, and cattle across a continent that actively resists being crossed. And everywhere you look, there's another canyon, another river, another gorge that drops 200, 300, 400 feet straight down. Stone bridges were the logical choice. Europeans had been building stone arch bridges for centuries. The Romans built aqueducts that are still standing. But stone bridges had 2 problems in America. First, they took years to build. Second, they cost a fortune. Railroad companies didn't have years, and they definitely didn't have fortunes to spend on single bridges when they needed to build hundreds of miles of track. So they turned to wood. Wood was cheap. Wood was abundant. You could cut it from the forest right next to the construction site. And if you knew what you were doing, if you understood load distribution and tension and compression, you could make wood do things that seemed impossible. The men who figured this out weren't trained engineers. Most of them were logging foremen, mill operators, bridge carpenters who'd learned by watching someone else. They understood wood the way you understand your own body. How much weight it could bear, where it would split, how to reinforce the weak points. But understanding wood and building a 300-foot structure out of it are 2 very different things. Let me describe what a wooden trestle actually looked like, because if you've never seen one, it's hard to grasp the scale. Imagine a series of wooden towers. Each tower is called a bent. Each bent sits on a foundation of either bedrock or timber cribbing, essentially a lattice of logs designed to distribute weight across unstable ground. From that foundation, vertical posts rise. In the tallest trestles, these posts were over 100 feet long. Not 100 feet of continuous timber, because trees don't grow that straight or that tall. These were spliced together, reinforced with iron bands, cross-braced with diagonal supports. At the top of each bent sat a cap beam, a massive horizontal timber that connected the vertical posts and provided the platform for the stringers, the long beams that ran the length of the trestle. On top of the stringers went the cross ties. On top of the cross ties went the rails. Each bent used 40,000 board feet of lumber. To put that in perspective, the average modern house uses about 16,000 board feet. Each tower of a wooden trestle used enough lumber to build 2.5 houses. And a trestle like Kinzua had over 90 of these bents. The spacing between bents varied depending on the terrain and the load requirements, but in most cases, they were 20 to 30 feet apart. Close enough that if one failed, the others might catch the load, or they might not. Now here's where it gets interesting. These weren't permanent structures. They weren't designed to last. The engineers who planned them knew they were building something temporary. 5 years, maybe 10, just long enough to generate enough revenue to justify replacing them with steel or stone. But the railroads didn't always replace them. Some of these wooden trestles carried trains for 30, 40, 50 years, long past the point where anyone thought they should still be standing. Let's talk about the Kinzua viaduct specifically, because it's the best documented example we have. In 1882, the New York, Lake Erie, and Western Railroad needed to cross the Kinzua Valley in McKean County, Pennsylvania. The valley was 301 feet deep at its lowest point and over 2,000 feet wide. There was no practical way to go around it. The only option was to go over it. The man in charge of the project was a civil engineer named Octave Chanute. So Chanute wasn't a household name, but he should have been. He later became one of the pioneers of aviation, working with the Wright brothers and publishing research on glider flight. But in 1882, he was just a railroad engineer trying to solve an impossible problem. Chanute's design called for a trestle 2,053 feet long and 301 feet high at its tallest point. The structure would consist of 20 towers, each built from Douglas fir and white pine. The timeline? 94 days. That's 3 months to cut, transport, shape, and assemble over 3 million board feet of lumber into a structure taller than any wooden bridge that had ever been built. The work began in May. By August, the trestle was complete. How? The answer is simple and brutal. You throw enough men at the problem and you accept the cost. The workers on the Kinzua Viaduct were a mix of local laborers, experienced bridge carpenters, and men who just needed the work. Daily wages range from $1 to $2, depending on your skill level. That's about $30 to $60 in today's money. Not much, but in 1882 in rural Pennsylvania, it was enough to feed a family. The work started at the bottom of the valley. Teams of men excavated foundation pits, sometimes blasting through rock with dynamite, sometimes digging by hand through layers of clay and shale. Once the foundation was set, the first bent could go up. Raising a bent was a coordinated operation. You needed timber framers to cut and fit the posts. You needed riggers to hoist the beams into place using block and tackle. You needed men on the ground managing the ropes, and men at the top guiding the timbers into position. One mistake, one rope that slipped, one beam that twisted as it was lifted, and someone died. There's no complete record of how many men died building the Kinzua Viaduct. The newspapers of the time mention several fatalities but don't name them. The company records, if they existed, are lost. What we do know is that men fell. Men were crushed by falling timbers. Men died from infections after injuries that today would be minor. At 300 feet, there was no room for error. You're working on a platform maybe 3 feet wide. Below you, there's nothing but air. The wind at that height doesn't blow steadily. It gusts. It changes direction. It catches the beam you're holding and turns it into a sail. And suddenly, you're fighting to keep your balance while simultaneously trying to keep 800 pounds of timber from swinging into the man next to you. You can't wear gloves because you need to feel the wood to know if you've got a good grip. So your hands are covered in splinters, your palms bleed. In winter, your fingers go numb, and you have to keep working because stopping means falling behind schedule. And falling behind schedule means losing your job. There were no safety regulations, no OSHA, no workers' compensation. If you got hurt, you were done. If you died, your family got nothing. And yet, they built it. In 94 days, they built a structure that would carry fully loaded freight trains for the next 18 years. But Kinzua wasn't the only wooden trestle in America. It was just the most famous. The Northern Pacific Railway built dozens of trestles across the Cascade Range in Washington. The Leicester Bridge, one of the tallest, stood over 200 feet high and carried trains through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the country. The winters there were brutal. Snow piled 15, 20 feet deep. Ice formed on the timbers, making every step treacherous. And the work didn't stop. Maintenance crews had to clear snow, replace damaged beams, and inspect the structure for signs of weakness, all while temperatures dropped below zero. In Montana, the Marant Gulch trestle spanned a canyon 260 feet deep. In Idaho, the Trestle Creek Bridge crossed a gorge that flooded every spring, putting immense lateral pressure on the foundation piers. In California, the Sierra Nevada required trestles that could withstand not just the weight of trains, but the weight of snow, the force of avalanches, and the seismic activity of a geologically active region. Each of these structures was designed to be temporary. Each of them lasted far longer than anyone expected, and each of them was maintained by men who understood that one broken beam, one rotted post, one missed crack could bring the whole thing down. Let me tell you what it was like to work on one of these trestles, because the physical reality of it is something most people don't understand. You start your day before sunrise. The foreman blows a whistle and you grab your tools, a saw, a hammer, a chisel, a mallet, and adze if you're shaping beams. You climb the trestle using ladders built into the bents, or sometimes just using the cross bracing as handholds. At 200, 250, 300 feet, you step onto the working platform. The first thing you notice is the sound. The wind doesn't whistle, it roars. It moves through the structure like a living thing, and you can hear the timbers flexing. That's not a figure of speech. Wood is elastic, it bends under load. A wooden trestle in a strong wind actually sways. Not much, maybe a few inches. But when you're standing on it, when you can feel the movement under your feet, it's enough to make your stomach drop. The second thing you notice is the smell. Fresh-cut timber has a sharp, clean scent. Pine smells sweet. Fir smells almost medicinal. But older wood that's been exposed to the elements, smells different. It smells like rot, even when it's not rotten. It smells like creosote if it's been treated. It smells like smoke if a locomotive passed underneath recently. The third thing you notice is the emptiness below you. Your brain doesn't process height well. At 300 feet, the ground doesn't look that far away. It looks closer than it should. You could almost believe you could survive the fall, but you can't. At that height, hitting the ground is the same as hitting concrete. Your body doesn't bounce, it shatters, and you're working up there for 10, 12, 14 hours a day. You're lifting beams that weigh hundreds of pounds. You're driving spikes through timber using a sledgehammer. You're cutting mortise and tenon joints by hand, because that's how you join the beams. You're doing all of this while standing on a plank that's 3 feet wide, with nothing to catch you if you slip. In summer, the heat is unbearable. The sun reflects off the wood, and the temperature on the working platform can reach 120 degrees. You drink water from a canteen that tastes like metal. You sweat through your clothes. Dehydration is a constant risk. In winter, it's worse. Your hands go numb. Your feet go numb. The wood becomes slick with ice, and every step is a gamble. You can't work in gloves because you need dexterity, so your fingers crack and bleed. Frostbite is common. Men lost fingers, toes, sometimes whole hands to the cold. And through it all, you're aware that the structure you're building is designed to fail. Not immediately, not today, but eventually. Wood rots. Wood warps. Wood catches fire. And when it fails catastrophically. Fire was the single greatest threat to wooden trestles. Locomotives in the 1880s and 1890s didn't have spark arresters. Or if they did, they didn't work very well. Every time a train crossed a trestle, sparks from the firebox would shoot out of the smokestack and land on the timbers. Most of the time, nothing happened. The wood was damp, or the sparks were too small, or the wind blew them out before they could ignite. But sometimes the conditions were perfect. Dry wood, low humidity, a strong wind to fan the flames, and once a wooden trestle caught fire, there was no stopping it. The Leicester Bridge burned in 1893. A spark from a passing locomotive ignited the top deck. By the time the fire was noticed, it had spread to 3 bents. The Northern Pacific sent crews with water pumps, but it didn't matter. The fire burned too hot. The structure collapsed into the canyon, taking with it over 1 million board feet of timber. The Marant Gulch Trestle burned in 1900. The Trestle Creek Bridge burned in 1904. Dozens of smaller trestles burned every year, and the railroads just rebuilt them. It was cheaper to replace a trestle than to build a permanent stone or steel bridge. But the fires killed people too. Maintenance crews caught on the structure when the fire started. Train crews who didn't realize the trestle was burning until it was too late. There are accounts of men jumping from burning trestles, choosing the fall over the flames. One account from a Northern Pacific worker named James Haggerty describes a fire on a trestle near Stampede Pass in 1897. Haggerty was part of a maintenance crew working on the top deck when a locomotive passed below. He saw the sparks land on the dry timber and immediately started shouting for everyone to get off. Most of the crew made it to solid ground. 2 men didn't. Haggerty wrote that he could hear them screaming as the flames engulfed the structure. He wrote that the sound stayed with him for the rest of his life. Wind was the second greatest threat. Wooden trestles were designed to handle vertical loads. They were built to support the weight of locomotives, freight cars, passengers, cargo, but they weren't designed to handle lateral loads. High winds put immense pressure on the structure, and if the wind was strong enough, it could literally push the trestle over. In 1889, a trestle on the Great Northern Railway in Montana collapsed during a windstorm. The structure was only 150 feet high, but the wind that day was estimated at over 70 miles per hour. Witnesses reported that the trestle didn't collapse all at once. It swayed first, back and forth, like a tree in a storm. And then, one bent gave way. When the first bent failed, the load shifted to the adjacent bents, and they failed too. The collapse took less than 10 seconds. A freight train was crossing the trestle at the time. The engineer saw the structure failing and tried to reverse. But it was too late. The locomotive, tender, and 3 freight cars went down with the trestle. The engineer and firemen were killed. The conductor, who was in the caboose, survived because the rear section of the trestle held long enough for the caboose to reach solid ground. Investigations after wind collapses almost always came to the same conclusion. The trestle was too tall, too narrow, and too lightly braced to withstand sustained high winds. The solution was to add more diagonal bracing, more cross members, more support, but that added weight, which put more stress on the foundation, which increased the risk of settlement and structural failure. There was no perfect solution. Every design was a compromise between strength and weight, between cost and safety, between what was needed and what was possible. And then there was simple structural failure. Wood rots. It's organic, it breaks down. And in a structure as large as a railroad trestle, you can't inspect every beam, every post, every joint. You do your best. You send crews out to look for obvious signs of decay, soft spots, discoloration, insect damage, but you can't see inside the wood. You can't see the internal rot that's eating away at the structural integrity. In 1901, a trestle on the Southern Pacific Railway in California collapsed without warning. No fire, no wind. The structure had been inspected 2 weeks earlier and deemed sound, but when a loaded freight train crossed, one of the main support posts simply gave way. The post had been rotted from the inside, weakened by moisture and fungal decay. And when the train passed over, the load exceeded the post's capacity. The train derailed. 4 cars went over the side. 2 men died. The investigation revealed that over 30% of the timbers in the trestle showed signs of internal rot. The structure had been operating on borrowed time for years. This wasn't an isolated incident. Trestle collapses due to rot were common. Some railroads tried treating the timber with creosote or other preservatives, but the treatments were expensive and not always effective. Some railroads replaced the most critical timbers on a regular schedule, but that required shutting down the line, which cost money. Most railroads just accepted the risk. They knew trestles would fail. They knew men would die. But the cost of prevention was higher than the cost of replacement, so they kept the trestles in service until they collapsed. Now, let's talk about what happened to the Kinzua Viaduct after its initial construction. For 18 years, the wooden Kinzua Viaduct carried trains across the valley. By 1900, the structure was showing its age. The timbers were weathered. Some of the posts showed signs of rot. The railroad decided it was time to rebuild, but instead of replacing it with another wooden trestle, they rebuilt it in iron. The new Kinzua Viaduct, completed in 1900, used the same basic design but substituted iron for wood. The iron structure was stronger, more durable, and less susceptible to fire. It was also much more expensive, but by 1900, the railroad could afford it. The iron Kinzua Viaduct stood for over a century. It became a landmark. Tourists came to see it. Photographers captured it. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And then, On July 21st, 2003, a tornado hit. The tornado was rated F1, with winds estimated at 100 miles per hour. Not a massive tornado by any standard, but it was enough. The wind caught the trestle and twisted it. 11 of the 20 towers collapsed. The entire eastern section of the structure came down in less than a minute. No one was on the trestle when it happened. No one was killed, but the Kinzua viaduct, the structure that had survived over a century of use, was destroyed by the same force that had threatened its wooden predecessor: wind. Today, the remains of the Kinzua viaduct are a tourist attraction. You can walk out onto the surviving western section and look down at the wreckage of the towers that fell. There's an observation deck, interpretive signs, a visitor center. But the men who built the original wooden trestle in 1882, they're not mentioned. There's no memorial, no list of names, just a footnote in the history of the structure. The Leicester Bridge in the Cascade Range met a different fate. After the fire in 1893, the Northern Pacific rebuilt it, and it burned again in 1904. They rebuilt it again, and it burned again in 1912. After the third fire, they finally gave up and built a steel bridge. The Marant Gulch Trestle was replaced with a steel structure in 1910. The Trestle Creek Bridge was replaced in 1915. By 1920, like most of the major wooden trestles in America had been replaced with steel or abandoned entirely. But some survived. In isolated areas where traffic was light and budgets were tight, wooden trestles remained in service well into the mid-20th century. A few are still standing today, preserved as historical landmarks. The Trestle Ridge Trail in Washington crosses the remains of a Northern Pacific trestle built in 1887. The timbers are still there, weathered and gray, slowly returning to the forest. You can walk across it. You can touch the beams. You can see the mortise and tenon joints, still tight after 130 years. But walking across it today, as a tourist, is nothing like working on it in 1887. You're not 200 feet in the air. You're not holding a sledgehammer. The wind isn't trying to kill you. So what do we owe these men? The men who built the Kinzua viaduct in 94 days? The men who worked on the Leicester Bridge until it burned? The men who fell, who were crushed, who died from infections and frostbite and exhaustion? They made the railroads possible. The railroads made industrialization possible. Industrialization made modern America possible. Everything we have, everything we take for granted, exists because men were willing to work at 300 feet with no harnesses and $1.50 in their pockets. And we don't even know most of their names. There's something deeply wrong about that. We preserve the structures, or what's left of them. We turn them into tourist attractions. We take photos. We marvel at the engineering. But we don't talk about the cost. I'm not saying we should feel guilty. Guilt doesn't help anyone. But we should remember, we should understand that progress has a price, and someone always pays it. The men who built wooden trestles paid with their bodies. Some of them paid with their lives. They didn't do it for glory. They didn't do it to be remembered. They did it because it was the work that was available, and they needed to feed their families. But the fact that they didn't expect to be remembered doesn't mean we shouldn't remember them. Here's what I want you to take away from this. The next time you cross a bridge, any bridge, think about who built it. Think about the men who dug the foundations, who set the beams, who drove the rivets. Think about the conditions they worked in, the tools they had, the risks they took. And understand that every piece of infrastructure you use, every road, every tunnel, every bridge, was built by someone who probably isn't remembered. Someone who worked for wages that barely covered rent. Someone who knew the risks and did the work anyway because there was no other choice. The wooden trestles are mostly gone now, replaced, burned, collapsed, reclaimed by the forest. But the men who built them deserve more than a footnote. They deserve more than a passing mention in a historical marker. They deserve to be remembered as what they were: skilled workers who accomplished something extraordinary under conditions that were, by any measure, insane. 301 feet, 94 days, no harnesses, no nets, no second chances. That's what it took to build America's railroads. And if you want to understand the true cost of progress, that's where you start.